Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and introduction. It's really good to be with you all. My name is René. I use he, him pronouns. It's always great to come and practice with you all. And today I want to explore the topic of pleasure, how pleasure shows up in our practice, how we might work with it in our practice, the spirit of inquiry and exploring together around this topic. As was mentioned, I work as a restorative justice facilitator. I specifically work on healing around sexual harm, sexual trauma, including working with people who have caused harm. And as part of that work, I've been really diving into exploring consent, how it is that we, do things that cross people's boundaries or, invite or allow our own boundaries to be crossed. And as part of that, I've been learning a lot from someone named Dr. Betty Martin. Got her book here today, The Art of Receiving and Giving. I've been studying with her, and she has created what she calls the School of Consent. She teaches workshops all around the world, actually, around consent. And I've been studying with her, and I'm learning to become a facilitator of this particular kind of methodology. And I want to bring a little bit of this in today. For me, it's very much a mindfulness practice actually around how we engage with pleasure. So I want to invite us into one of Betty's practices. It's called Waking Up the Hands. And for folks who are here in the room, I've got a box of objects here. I'm going to send around. So I invite you to just pick an object and pass the basket along to the next person. For folks who are on Zoom or listening to this later, I invite you to just pick an object in your space. It really can be anything. It could be a pen or a phone or a, tchotchke that you've got there. So just pick something. And then as we're distributing the objects, don't overthink it. Just grab an object. Any object will do. I also want to invite us all into getting comfortable. So part of this practice that we're going to be doing with sensation is actually setting our bodies up to feel as comfy as possible. So for those in the room, it's a little bit of a challenge because we've got the folding chairs that are not comfy. But if you're at home, I encourage you to really get comfy. So if you've got a couch, maybe you're like the long way on the couch, or maybe you're in your recliner and you're like reclined back as comfy as possible. And also invite you to find a pillow and just place that on your lap with your object. So we're just going to get comfy, maybe slouch down a little bit, grab a cushion if you don't already have one. Have your object in your hands. So, and folks at home, inviting you also to just get set up in maximum comfort for this exercise. Just going to give another moment for setup here. And as much as possible, invite you to relax the body. Make sure in particular that your shoulders and arms are in a position where they feel relaxed and supported. And then maybe you've got your object in your hand, and just taking a moment as we begin the practice, just to tune into just a feeling of relaxation, feeling the body is supported, maybe taking a deep breath and letting it out. And then you've got this object in your hand, and just to beginning to explore this object. So you just might look at it, touch it, notice maybe the colors, the textures, starting to explore this object with our hands. And we might initially, or just taking this object in, be noticing what it is, what it's for. Maybe it has a purpose. You might be thinking about how you might use it or how it works. So just in that first layer of investigation, naming it in our minds, thinking about what it does. And then I invite you to let that part of interacting with the object go, like letting go what it is, what it's for, associations we might have with it, and maybe even closing the eyes and really focusing in on the tactile sensation of the object. So might be using our fingers or palms to investigate this object. Maybe particularly noticing texture. Is it smooth or rough? How does it fit in your hand? Maybe even taking a moment just to hold it. Notice the sensations of holding the object in your hand. You might also use one hand to move the object over the other hand. Notice if there's other kinds of sensations available by using the object to touch the front of your hand or the back of your hand. You might notice the difference in sensations there. And as you continue this investigation, noticing sensations, I invite you to slow down. So however fast you've been moving, I invite you to go half that speed. Continuing to feel the object, but letting it move more slowly, or letting your hands move more slowly. Again, just noticing the sensations. You might also see if there are different parts of your hands that are more sensitive to the sensations. You might notice the sides of the fingers or in between the fingers. Maybe noticing what happens when you touch the object to your wrist. And continuing to slow down. What happens when we move even more slowly? And all of our awareness here is on this, on the sensations of our hands. And I invite you to notice what feels good. And maybe even look for other ways that this sensation could feel good. Maybe there's a particular spot that really feels good. And explore that, maybe with even more slowness. Continuing to explore the sensations. Maybe if we've been particularly feeling the sensations on one hand, we might try, what is it like to feel the other hand? We might notice if we're using our dominant hand to manipulate the object, maybe switching to our non-dominant hand. And just noticing what arises and bringing all of our attention to these sensations. There may be feelings that come up. There may be things that happen in the body. Just taking all of that in, noticing. With a particular emphasis on noticing what feels pleasant or what feels good in this exploration. And letting go of thoughts about it or any planning. We're going to be with this exploration for another minute or so. And inviting again, even another slowing down. And just coming to completion with this. Maybe offering some gratitude to your object for any sensations that you received. And I invite for folks in the room, just passing the basket again and putting your objects back in the basket. And as we do that, I'm just curious for folks, like what did you notice in this activity? Was there anything surprising? Yeah.
I noticed my hands were really sensitive around the like the base right here, which is same as my feet. I'm like really ticklish there too, but I never really noticed them.
Wow. Yeah. That's such great noticing. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Anything surprising or?
Yeah, and there's my wrists were really sensitive,
Mhm.
like a ride.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other things folks noticed? Anyone on Zoom? Yeah.
Yeah, I would, in exploring, it always seemed for me, preferable to explore with both hands as opposed to individuals doing one side together. That's why that is.
Yeah. Mhm.
I often noticed when I would slide my fingers together, it was very pleasurable.
Mhm. Yeah, I might also notice like just our own hands touching each other and some of that sensation.
Well, and also in terms of the object, because my object was a little vase or a little
Mhm.
bowl, then sort of like the cognition that the brain also took in other things that are in similar objects in my everyday life.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it's like that pattern arises. So it's not just the bowl, but it was all the other experiences coming before.
Mhm.
So quieting the mind, sort of going back to just the fingers.
Right.
Just sit on the cushion.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also curious if there was anything you noticed in slowing down, like if anything shifted and moving more slowly with your object. Yeah.
I use my hand mallet, which I carry around with me a lot, so I really enjoy touching it.
Mhm.
Soft tulsi wood, and it's not machine made, but it's very smooth. And so I had to be creative about like, new sensations with it, so I rolled it, like you said, but I like the wheel, the way the beads turn, and I rub my face with it,
Mhm.
and you know, in the Middle East, they call them worry beads.
Mhm.
I find that's very helpful. Sometimes if I'm really scattered, I throw them around like this.
Mhm.
So, but it brought me closer to the sensation.
Mhm. Yeah. I see someone who looks like they've got their hand raised.
Regardless of the speed or position, I just found the whole exercise very relaxing. Just, I mean,
Mhm.
no rush, no tension. It was nice.
Great. Yeah. Yeah, it was great with anyone else on Zoom before we move on. Last call for Zoom folks. But yeah, just like really appreciating all of these noticings and one of the things that Betty Martin points out in this exercise is just, how many nerve endings we have in our hands. Like our hands are incredibly sensitive. Besides our like lips and our genitals, they're have the most nerve endings in our bodies, in our hands. And we're just using them all the time. And so this is this invitation to really slow down and notice touch. And in this case, touching an inanimate object where there's nobody else on the other side. So there's no we might even notice like summarizing of whether or not we might think that the object might be receiving pleasure in this case, but it's not, it's an object. So we can really focus in on our own sensations, on our own pleasure in this little exercise of touch with an inanimate object. And she really offers this as kind of a foundational practice of, coming into our own awareness of what feels good to us, what kind of, what kind of touch feels good, what kind of touch we want, in this instance where we're just really engaging with ourselves and the object. So I just wanted to invite it because it's also, I find when I'm doing it, it really feels like a mindfulness practice. It feels like I'm really dropping into a meditative space with pleasant sensation as my focus for the meditation. And, I've done it many, many times, and I keep kind of finding new sensations. There's a way in doing it for longer and repeating it that sometimes there's a lot of emotion that shows up. There's like a way, and you may have noticed this even in this short practice, that there's like this oh, I'm really receiving pleasure in this. And there might be a feeling of gratitude. It might be just a feeling. Sometimes it's just like a kind of wave of emotion or teariness that can arise. And just, yeah, recognizing how infrequently I might just stop and focus on pleasurable sensation. So yeah, so I just invite this, if something to try on for yourself at home, this focusing on pleasurable sensation. And so like, why, why bring this in to practice? And for me, I think, this one piece of wanting to invite pleasure into my practice is just that it is actually nourishing and resourcing for me in my practice. I think we've learned from neuroscience and other things that our brains really default towards what's unpleasant, what's a problem, what needs to be fixed. And this is a place to really stop and just be with what's pleasant, be with what's what's good in the moment. Just like walking down the street and stopping to notice a flower. And I was just walking over here, and this beautiful Mexican sage bush, just taking a moment and stop and smell that. Just all of these kinds of moments of stopping and noticing what's pleasant are actually, for me, very resourcing to my practice. It's like, these are the things that gives me more capacity to be with the moments of difficulty and suffering, is that bringing the mindfulness to what's pleasant. But I think also I'm really thinking of it in a context of wanting to create a world that's really free from violence and fear, especially around our sexuality and our gender. And so, I'm interested in how our exploration actually of pleasure can help create that. Yeah, and just even as we're talking about pleasure, it's like, well, what comes up when we even use the word pleasure in this context of practice? And you might have your own associations with that. Even just taking a moment to be like, how is it to be with this topic of pleasure? Is it something that feels like it's part of your practice right now? Are there ways already that pleasure shows up? I know for me, as I work more and more with the breath, I often find places of so much pleasure just in the exploration of the breath. Just feeling the in-breath and that cool nourishment of air, like the pause, and a little bit of ease there, and the release of the out-breath. There's like subtle pleasure, and when I'm really in my continuity of practice, so much pleasure can show up just in that simple act of breathing. And I was just on retreat not this past week, but the week before. And I came back and I was just noticing a lot of sadness. At some point I was just like, oh, I just miss being with the breath. I just miss that continuity of connection with my own sensations in that way. So it was a way of recognizing, oh, there's a lot of pleasure here. And I think, I've practiced now for over 20 years in insight, Buddhism, Theravada tradition. And sometimes it feels to me like there's a anti-pleasure kind of attitude there. And certainly like there's teachings in, maybe the 4 foundations of mindfulness of the body that can be sometimes like turning us away from the pleasure of the body, and especially when it relates to sexuality. And so there's a way that it sometimes, just feels like, is pleasure a part of our practice, at least in the lineage that I've been practicing and trained in for so long. And I know in other lineages, and particularly Vajrayana Buddhism, that it's different, that there's much more of an embracing of pleasure as part of our practice, and even as a very direct and speedy path to awakening. But that's something I, don't have as much basis to teach on, because I have not had as much time in practicing in Vajrayana. But one thing that I've thought is interesting in the Theravada teachings in the Pali Canon, there you've probably heard of the cycle of dependent origination and the ways that that we kind of stay in a cycle of suffering. But there's a second cycle that the Buddha talks about, and this particularly shows up in the Upasana Sutta. There is a second cycle that's called the transcendental dependent arising that also comes from our meeting suffering. And in that move from meeting suffering towards the really falling away of the fetters, or also call it like destruction of the outflows, there's this series of qualities that kind of follow one on the other. And so from suffering, there's an arising of faith when we're really meeting it, arising of faith. From there, an arising of gladness, and then rapture, and then calmness, and then happiness, and then concentration, and then a knowledge and insight into things as they are, followed by a disenchantment, dispassion, liberation, and then the destruction of the outflows or the fetters. So it's just I did 1 month-long retreat where we explored this cycle of transcendental dependent arising. And I was just so struck by, these are all these beautiful, very pleasurable states that the Buddha is talking about on this path to awakening. And laying them out kind of as mileposts, as like, here's how we know that we're on this path to awakening, is that we do experience this gladness, that we experience this rapture, that they are these blissful states, which I certainly have experienced those sometimes on retreat, these just moments of bliss and rapture. And that those are like the signs that we're on the path. So this piece of pleasure is like an important, I think what I'm taking away is that the Buddha is saying this is an important thing to pay attention to, because it actually shows us that we're on this path to awakening. So it definitely seems, yeah, important to pay attention to. Yeah, and I also want to kind of like bring in the question of like, what are we talking about when we talk about pleasure? One person who writes about, well, first I'll start just with Betty Martin. And she says, pleasure is a powerful change agent. Pleasure lets you make friends with your body, and that changes your sense of who you are in the world and your sense of self-worth, value, and compassion. Many fears and inner conflicts resolve. That is why it is often said that pleasure heals. And indeed, for many of us as professionals, and she is speaking as someone who does sex work and, a lot of coaching with people around sexual healing, pleasure is our primary healing modality. And I also was just actually listening on YouTube to Audre Lorde read The Uses of the Erotic, which is a just beautiful essay. If you've ever read it or listened to it, it was great to get to listen to her read it in her own words. And she's really talking about the erotic, but in many ways really speaking to the power of pleasure, of sensory pleasure. Here's just one piece from this essay. She says, another important way in which the erotic connection functions is the open and fearless underlining of my capacity for joy, in the way my body stretches to music and opens into response, hearkening to its deepest rhythms, so every level upon which I sense also opens to the erotically satisfying experience, whether it is dancing, building a bookcase, writing a poem, examining an idea. So here she's really talking about the erotic, not in the sense just of sexual pleasure, but of eros, of really like, in another part in the essay, she connects so that this is sensation meeting feeling. So it's not sensation by itself. It's not just about something, you know, that's just a sensory pleasure, but that it's meeting feeling. It's actually more moving into a place of us as a whole being. And she also says, when we look away from the importance of the erotic in the development and sustenance of our power, or when we look away from ourselves as we satisfy our erotic needs in concert with others, we use ourselves as objects of satisfaction rather than share our joy in the satisfying, rather than make connections with our similarities and differences. To refuse to be conscious of what we are feeling at any time, however comfortable that may seem, is to deny a large part of the experience and to allow ourselves to be reduced to the pornographic, the abused, and the absurd. So this is kind of another way where she's pointing to the sensation that we experience connecting to feeling, to meaning, to purpose. And anyway, highly recommend the uses of the erotic if you haven't already encountered it. And if you have, I like to revisit it regularly. And I also wanted to bring in Lama Rod Owens. I think you all know how much I love him. And his new book, New Saints, is out. And it's really a book about the Bodhisattva path. And, you know, speaking to his own experience and path and what he sees as what it means to be a Bodhisattva in this moment in time. So it's called the subtitle is From Broken Hearts to Spiritual Warriors. And in here, he outlines the 4 sweet liberations of the new saint or Bodhisattva. And one of the things he says is, there are so many ways we can experience pleasure. The phenomenal world is full of it. Pleasure is at the heart of all the sweet liberations. I enjoy beauty, opulence, and leisure. These experiences usher me into space, and it is in spaciousness I can experience the essence. So again, really pointing to the way that pleasure is bringing us into more of a sense of wholeness. And I think one thing that comes up is, you know, just in coming and talking about pleasure, it's like, oh, how can we focus on pleasure when there's so much wrong with the world, when there's so much suffering, conflict, and, you know, war and oppression. And I think for me, continuing to bring my attention to my own pleasure, continuing to make that part of my practice, actually is a process of integrity. And this is something Betty Martin also talks about, really in the context of how we can be in more integrity in our relationships, in touch. And this, it is without really being clear on what we want and what feels good to us. It's not possible really to be in integrity with our connections with other people. So really pointing to how that's actually our own pleasure is crucial to our own integrity in relationships. And she, so she's really pointing to pleasure as this path to integrity, and that by noticing, trusting, and valuing our own pleasure, are what we need, what we want, where our limits are, and communicating those to others. This is really like a path to integrity. And and I also want to mention Adrienne Marie Brown, who's another writer, thinker, who I've learned so much from. She wrote Emergent Strategy, and she has a concept that she's really, and maybe others have popularized it as well, but I feel like I first learned about it from her as this idea of pleasure activism. And she's got this book, Pleasure Activism, and it really resonates for me, this idea that we can, you know, like so much of our activism is around what we're trying to stop, you know, what we're saying no to, and that there's also an activism of what we want to create, what we want to build, and like what we want to be. And that pleasure, bringing pleasure into activism, is helping to create that new world. So in this, just in the introduction here, she's saying, what is pleasure activism? And she also defines pleasure as pleasure is a feeling of happy satisfaction and enjoyment. And then our activism is efforts to promote, you know, the political, economic, environmental reforms that we want to see, the improvements to society. And pleasure activism is the work we do to reclaim our whole, happy, and satisfiable selves from the impacts, delusions, and limitations of oppression and/or supremacy. And pleasure activism asserts that we all need and deserve pleasure, and that our social structures must reflect this. In this moment, we must prioritize the pleasure of those most impacted by oppression. So it's just really resonates for me, you know, just coming back to my own work around healing from and ending sexual and gender-based violence, that actually I'm curious what happens when we bring pleasure into that equation. You know, we've been using punishment to deal with sexual violence, and I feel like that has not helped create a world free from sexual violence. We use shame, and you know, there's definitely a place for our own remorse, regret, taking account and making amends, but I'm not sure that shame also helps with that process. So in my own work, I'm really in an exploration. What happens when actually we turn towards pleasure in trying to create a world where everyone is really treated as a full human and entitled to safety and boundaries and pleasure. So that's my own exploration. I'm sure I'll be back to report in at some future time on what I'm learning with all of that. But yeah, I'm just curious, you know, for all of you, how does pleasure show up in your practice? Is it something that is, you know, how does your practice help you cultivate more pleasure, more aliveness in your life? Does it support you to practice integrity with yourself and others? So yeah, I just wanted to open up and see if what comes up for you all, or if there's any questions in this exploration of pleasure.
I think a pivotal part is between saying yes and no,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of saying yes to life. So much of it's an odd thing, as you were pointing out, in Buddhism, we practice a form of detachment for fear of dukkha, or that thirst.
Mm-hmm.
And that also is a misperception that we are lacking. So part of the practice of saying yes into life is saying that I am already contented.
Mm-hmm.
So a practice of gratefulness helps. A practice of just saying yes to something that just arises, and just feel that I'm sufficient for the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So that practice of stability, that practice of saying, even if a new event or a new person arises, that I can meet that similar wholeness in them, or that
Mhm.
part of them that is pleasurable in life. And even a moment of part of them that are intended so that we can share. This part of it is just sharing and exploring others as, oddly enough, as ourselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
So saying yes is important. And for me, saying, and having those moments of gratefulness to know, even in a moment, whether a flower blooms or a child laughs, or, you know, or a dog poops, and you don't step in the poop, you know your basic stuff. Is so important. I mean, simple gifts, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and just bringing our attention to them.
Right.
Yeah. Mm. Continuing to take in all of those moments. Yeah. Thank you.
I really appreciate you bringing up this topic, because, having done a number of, long-term retreats, Spirit Rock, and I think, well, we're all prone to it, I suppose, as beginners, but it is a misunderstanding, as Bob pointed out, to think, I should be noting, pleasant vagrants, help, pleasant vagrants. And, instead of, pleasant, and, it just seemed to make people, be very, stiff,
Mm,
and you wonder, that it was kind of, seemed limiting,
Yeah.
to, not be spontaneous or, loosen up. Thank you.
mhm. Yeah, another thing that just makes me think, both of your comments makes me think of Lama Rod talks about how actually our desire for freedom, our longing for freedom, awakening is part of the path. Like, and he talks about how you need to like desire it until you're right on the threshold. And then when you're right on the threshold of awakening, you drop the desire and just tip over into it. It's very beautiful, but just like that, like our wholesome longings and our wholesome desires, as well as these integrating moments of pleasure on the path are so important. And I do think maybe particularly in the Western insight tradition that is missing. And there is sometimes just such a feeling of brittle dryness in the
Yeah.
practice, at least for me. Yeah.
It's about time. There's one last question. Anyone have?
Yeah, I want to see if there's anybody on Zoom
Yeah.
or also Jerry.
So, thanks for your topic, René. So what came up for me was, this probably happened to some people in this room, but when I was a toddler or younger, I loved to play with myself.
Hmm.
And my mother would come over and hit me and shame me. And I was
Mhm.
like, wow, so what happened after that?
Yeah.
And I mean, I still did it, but still do. But my friend, when I went to college with, she had a daughter, and we were talking about this, and she said, well, what I did with Georgia, her daughters, she said to her, honey, it's okay to masturbate or play with yourself, but you go to your room and you close the door. And I
Mhm.
wish my mother had said that instead of being slap me all the time and shame me.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of, also I heard a story from a friend recently about talking about just like being like, it's wonderful that you do this. And this is something we do in private,
Yes.
and like, oh, what a different
Uh-huh.
experience that is. Yeah. Yeah. I'm
Yeah, I'm sure it
so
happened to a couple
sad
people.
that so many,
She'd always
many of
say,
us have had that experience of shame and pleasure being, and pain all being put together. Okay, this will be the last one.
Just briefly, would you say that Thich Nhat Hanh is also an influence of yours?
when it comes to pleasure or practice.
I
kept thinking about
haven't-
his teachings during your talk.
I appreciate you bringing that in. I haven't done as much, listening and reading to him on this topic. So I'm curious if there's just one thing that you would recommend on this topic from him.
I mean, any of his books, but Pieces Every Step. I mean,
Mhm. Yeah.
it's all about enhancing the joyfulness and the relaxation and the appreciation
Yeah.
of everything, but especially small little movements.
Mhm. Yeah. I love his gathas, I think they're called.
Yes.
There's so much about those moments of pleasure.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for your kind attention and all of your questions and